There was a very specific ritual to weekday afternoons in the early 1980s. It wasn't written down anywhere, but every kid seemed to know it instinctively. You got home from school, the backpack hit the floor. Homework was later. The television came on immediately, because if you missed the opening seconds, you missed the transformation. And missing the transformation felt like missing the entire point. The screen shook. Lightning cracked. A skinny prince raised a sword that looked impossibly heavy, and suddenly the room felt bigger than it actually was. Not louder, bigger. As if the walls of your house had quietly stepped back to make room for something important. That phrase didn't feel like dialogue. It felt like a switch being flipped, a promise that weakness could be temporary, that power could be earned, that good didn't need to apologize for existing. For a generation of kids, He-Man was not just a cartoon. He was stability. He was repetition in a chaotic world. Same time, same opening, same certainty that good would stand its ground. In a decade defined by divorce rates, Cold War anxiety, and parents who were increasingly exhausted, He-Man offered something deceptively rare. Moral clarity, and then, without ceremony, it was gone. Not a dramatic final episode. Not a goodbye tour. One week it was there, anchoring afternoons, toy aisles, and playground conversations. The next week, it wasn't. Stations replaced it quietly. Stores phased out figures just as quietly. Adults shrugged and said things like, "Kids grow out of things," or "It just wasn't popular anymore." That explanation never held up, because nothing about He-Man felt like a show that was being abandoned by its audience. At its peak, Masters of the Universe wasn't merely successful, it was culturally dominant. It was one of the rare properties that didn't just ride a trend, it defined one. So when it disappeared, the silence felt wrong. What we were told at the time was simple. The show had run its course. Kids wanted something different. The market moved on. That's how entertainment works. But that story only works if you ignore the data, the business decisions, and the people who were actually paying attention. Because He-Man didn't fade away. It wasn't gently replaced. It wasn't outcompeted. It was dismantled. This was not the natural end of a children's cartoon. It was the result of a series of decisions made by people who misunderstood what they had built, overestimated their control, and panicked the moment growth stopped being exponential. This is the story of how one of the most successful children's franchises of all time was treated like a disposable product line. How short-term thinking hollowed out something that could have lasted decades without interruption. And how the official explanation, changing tastes, declining interest, was a convenient fiction that protected the people who made the real choices. He-Man didn't lose the audience. The audience was abandoned. This didn't die naturally, it was killed. The first thing to understand about He-Man's rise is that it was not an accident, and it was not built on nostalgia. It was engineered with frightening precision. He-Man was born out of failure. In the late 1970s, Mattel had a problem. Their flagship boys' action figure line, Big Jim, was collapsing. Star Wars had changed the rules of the toy industry almost overnight. Smaller figures, more characters, endless expansion. Mattel didn't just need a new toy, they needed a system. The original idea was Conan the Barbarian. Muscles, swords, fantasy. That license didn't materialize, but instead of scrapping the concept, Mattel did something very corporate and very dangerous. They kept the visual language and built something new around it. What they didn't have was a story. That's where Filmation came in. And this is where the rise of He-Man becomes more interesting than most people remember. Filmation was not a prestige studio. They were efficient. They reused animation. They worked fast. But they understood something critical about children's television that many studios ignored. Kids didn't just want spectacle. They wanted consistency. Eternia was designed to feel eternal, not modern, not futuristic in a dated way. It blended magic and technology so that it never felt anchored to a specific decade. Castle Grayskull could exist in the distant past or the far future. That ambiguity gave the world weight, and the characters mattered. Skeletor wasn't funny in the way later villains would be. He was bitter, obsessive, petty. He wanted power because he believed it had been denied to him. He wasn't chaotic. He was resentful. Kids understood that instinctively. He-Man, by contrast, was powerful without being cruel. He didn't dominate for dominance's sake. He protected. He intervened. He modeled a version of masculinity that was confident without being sadistic. That mattered more than anyone at Mattel initially realized. The show also benefited from a regulatory loophole that would not last forever. Cartoons could still exist primarily to sell toys as long as they wrapped themselves in moral lessons. Filmation leaned into that requirement, turning it into a feature rather than a burden. Each episode ended with a lesson, not because it was artistically necessary, but because it gave parents something to point to. That combination, fantasy power for kids, moral reassurance for parents, created trust. And trust is the most valuable currency in children's entertainment. From a business perspective, Masters of the Universe became a self-feeding machine. The cartoon drove toy sales. The toy sales justified more episodes. The episodes introduced new characters. The characters became new toys. It was a perfectly closed loop. But here's the key point that often gets lost. It worked because the world came first. The toys felt like artifacts from a place that existed whether you were watching or not. Kids weren't just collecting plastic. They were collecting membership in a universe. At its height, He-Man wasn't a show kids watched. It was something they lived inside, and from the outside, it looked unstoppable, which is exactly when it became vulnerable. The collapse of He-Man didn't begin with bad writing or falling ratings. It began with success becoming uncomfortable. When a product grows fast, executives celebrate. When it stops growing faster, they panic. By the mid-1980s, Masters of the Universe was everywhere, and that was the problem. Shelves were full. Warehouses were full. The line had expanded so aggressively that retailers started running out of physical space. This is where toy economics get brutal. Retail shelf space is not infinite. When a line balloons, it doesn't just take up room. It becomes risky. If a store orders too much and it doesn't move, they're stuck. So the moment retailers sense hesitation from consumers, they pull back hard. Parents were already feeling fatigue. The sheer number of figures became overwhelming. Characters no longer felt essential. They felt arbitrary, designed to fill pegs, not stories. And inside Mattel, the mindset shifted. He-Man stopped being a narrative world and started being a revenue extraction system. The question was no longer, what fits Eternia? It was, how many units can this sell? That shift poisoned everything. The toy line became bloated. Characters lost narrative weight. The show struggled to keep up with the sheer volume of new figures. Instead of deepening the world, episodes became delivery systems for designs. Then came the decision that sealed the franchise's fate. Mattel decided that He-Man needed to grow older, not evolve, not mature organically, be repositioned. The logic, on paper, was clean. The original audience was aging. Younger kids were being courted by newer properties. So instead of defending the core, Mattel chased a hypothetical future audience. The result was The New Adventures of He-Man. This wasn't a gentle transition. It was a hard reset. Eternia was replaced by space. Myth was replaced by sci-fi aesthetics that already felt dated. Familiar elements vanished. The tone shifted. The visual language changed. To executives, it looked bold. To the audience, it felt like betrayal. Kids who loved the original didn't recognize it. New viewers had no emotional entry point. The franchise lost its identity overnight. And when toy sales dipped, as they inevitably would, panic set in. Instead of course-correcting, Mattel doubled down. They treated the brand like a failing stock rather than a damaged relationship. More changes, more attempts to force relevance, less patience. Then came the movie. The live-action Masters of the Universe film was supposed to restore prestige. Instead, it confirmed confusion. It barely resembled the world fans loved. It was constrained by budget, stripped of scale, and disconnected from the emotional core of the franchise. Financially, it was a disappointment. Strategically, it was devastating. At that moment, He-Man ceased to be seen internally as a foundation. He became a liability. And corporations do not protect liabilities. The plug was pulled. Not with mourning, not with reflection, but with spreadsheets. When a franchise collapses, the official narrative focuses on brands, numbers, and strategy. What gets erased are the people who built the thing in the first place, and the people who trusted it. Filmation's writers were never treated as auteurs, but they carried a heavier burden than most animation teams of the era. They had to create weekly stories under extreme production constraints. Limited animation, reused shots, tight deadlines, constant pressure to introduce new characters without breaking the moral framework that parents had come to expect. And despite all that, they managed to build something coherent, something emotionally legible, something kids could follow even if they missed episodes. When Mattel pivoted, those writers weren't consulted. They weren't brought into a room and asked how to evolve Eternia. They were handed a mandate: new setting, new tone, new assumptions. Make it work. You can hear the strain if you go back and watch those later episodes. The dialogue becomes explanatory instead of mythic. The characters talk about the world instead of inhabiting it. That's not incompetence. That's a creative team trying to retrofit a soul into a body that no longer fits. Animators felt it too. Filmation was already running at full capacity. The push to redesign characters, environments, and entire visual systems meant more work without more time. The result wasn't innovation, it was exhaustion. Then there were the performers. Voice actors like John Irwin and Alan Oppenheimer didn't just read lines. They defined personalities that still echo decades later. Skeletor's voice alone became shorthand for a specific kind of theatrical villainy. When the franchise shifted direction, those performances were asked to carry tones they were never designed for. Familiar voices were suddenly speaking in unfamiliar worlds, and the disconnect was obvious. And none of these people were protected. When the plug was pulled, there was no transition plan, no preservation of momentum. Filmation itself would shut down not long after, its legacy scattered across reruns and VHS tapes, while its talent moved on quietly. But the most overlooked cost wasn't inside the studio. It was in the audience. Kids don't articulate betrayal the way adults do. They just feel it. Something that felt dependable suddenly disappears, and they don't have language for why it hurts. He-Man wasn't just entertainment. It was structure. It was predictability in a decade where many households were anything but predictable. When it vanished, it taught a subtle lesson that stuck longer than anyone intended. Things you love can be taken away without explanation. That lesson landed hard for a generation that would later grow up suspicious of reboots, skeptical of corporate nostalgia, and deeply aware that brands do not love you back. You can trace that cynicism straight back to moments like this. He-Man never truly went away, but he never fully returned either. Over the years, there were revivals, reimaginings, new animated series that tried to reclaim the mythic tone, darker interpretations, nostalgia-driven callbacks. Each one arrived carrying the same invisible weight, the need to justify why the original ended the way it did. Ownership complications didn't help. Licensing deals fractured creative control. Every new version had to negotiate not just audience expectations, but corporate caution. No one wanted another overreach. No one wanted to bet too hard. So He-Man existed in fragments, recognizable, beloved, but never again allowed to dominate the way he once did. And that's the final irony. The collapse that executives feared, oversaturation, audience fatigue, was exactly what their decisions created. Not because the brand was too big, but because it was handled as if size alone guaranteed survival. The real lesson of He-Man's fall isn't about children's television. It's about misunderstanding loyalty. Mattel assumed the audience would follow wherever the brand went. That trust could be spent endlessly. That identity could be swapped out without consequence. They were wrong. Audiences don't abandon worlds they love easily. But they do walk away when they're told, explicitly or implicitly, that their attachment doesn't matter. He-Man didn't fail because kids grew up. He failed because the people in charge decided growth mattered more than coherence. Speed mattered more than care, and control mattered more than connection. That decision didn't just end a cartoon. It reshaped how an entire generation learned to love entertainment. With affection, yes, but also with suspicion. So the next time you hear someone say that a beloved franchise just ran out of steam, remember He-Man. Remember how unstoppable he felt. Remember how fast that strength was squandered. And ask yourself a harder question. How many other things from your childhood didn't disappear because they were weak, but because someone powerful decided they were expendable?